As in the case of other Indian English poets, she is a bilingual writer, wrote in English and Malayalam. She has received many awards for her excellent writing that I'll tell you later. She received Kerala Sahitya Academy Award in 1969 for her collection of Malayalam short stories. She wrote in English. Most of her poems are written in English. About her choice of English as a medium, she says in one of the poems, and this poem is one of the representative poems of Kamala Das. The lines from the poems are, I'm Indian, very brown, born in Malabar. I speak 3 languages, write in 2, dream in 1. The language I speak becomes mine, its distortions, its squareness, all mine, mine alone. This was actually her statement in one of the poems regarding English as a medium. Now, her popularity in Kerala is chiefly based on her short stories and autobiography, while her ova, you just look at the word, maybe if you're not familiar, O-E-U-V-R-E. Ova is actually a word which is sometimes asked in some competitive examinations, also in the language portion. Over is one's a total output. For example, when we say Shakespeare's over, it means all the literary works of Shakespeare. So, her over in English, written under the name Kamala Das, is noted for her poems and also for her frank, candid, and explicit autobiography. She was also a widely read columnist and wrote on various subjects, including women's issues, childcare, politics, etc. Now, she lived in multitudes. She spoke and wrote across languages, as I told you that she wrote in English and Malayalam. And she gave herself various names. She took many names, and this question was asked many times in different competitive examinations, especially in UGC NET examination. So just concentrate on that, listen to this attentively. She took on the name Das after marriage, when she became Kamala Das. She is also Kamala Suraiya, the name she took after converting to Islam in 1999. Once this question was asked, that which Indian English poetess was converted to Islam, she became Kamala Suraiya. She is also Madhavi Kutty, the pseudonym she gave herself when writing in Malayalam. So Madhavi Kutty. And finally, she is also Ami, A-M-I, Ami, a pet name she reserved for herself in her memoirs. So she is Kamala Das, she is Kamala Suraiya, she is Madhavi Kutty, she is Ami. So these are, some objective type, answers which you must remember, maybe if you're appearing for competitive examinations. Now, when you talk about the family background of Kamala Das, it was very rich. She took to writing like her mother. Her great uncle Nalapat Narayan Menon, he was also a very prominent writer, and he laid a great influence on her personality. She fell in love with poetry from a very early age. At the age of 15, she was married to one Madhav Das, a banker by profession. He also encouraged her to write, though marital relationships were not healthy, that you will come to know later. Now, her candid and honest treatment of female sexuality, free from any sense of guilt, filled her writing with power, and she got hope after freedom. The kind of picture which I have just told you emerges is of an iconoclast. She's an iconoclast, rebel, non-conformist, frank, candid, or using K. Srinivas Iyengar's words, aggressively individualistic. This was actually the phrase which has been used by K. Srinivas Iyengar. Aggressively individualistic in a generation. Now, she was the first woman who started talking about sex very candidly and frankly and very negatively of marriage in a society, in that typical Indian society, which is very conservative. When she published her autobiography, My Story, where she has dealt all these issues, it drew criticism, and critics attack on her. People attacked on her, and they said that the text is very obscene, very vulgar. So the charges of vulgarity and obscenity were laid on her, especially in the case of My Story, which is her autobiography. Now, a biopic was also made on her. A biopic. The title of that biopic was Army, and which was directed by Kamala, and it was released on February 9, 2018. Now, we are living in an era of technology, and nobody can, all of you, I think you are guided by your Google, guru. So when you say Google Guru, I think you'll be familiar with Google Doodle also. You see doodles there. Her works, the works of Kamala Das, have inspired Google Doodle in the year 2018, celebrating the 42 years since My Story first went to press. The Doodle pictured Kamala Das against a radiant purple background that fades to black as flowers emerge and bloom from city houses. You can Google and you can find out the doodle which was made in 2018. There was a vacuum in the field of in the domain of literature when on 31st May 2009, aged 75, Kamala Das died at a hospital in Pune. I told you in the beginning that she received many awards. In 1963, she received PEN Asian Poetry Prize. 1968, she received Kerala Sahitya Academy Award for Story. 1984, she was shortlisted for the prestigious Nobel Prize in Literature. 1985, Kendriya Sahitya Academy Award. 1988, Kerala State Film Award for Best Story. So, for her best work, for her best creations, she received many awards. In 1976, as I told you, her autobiography, My Story, was published. Two collections of short stories were published. One in the year 1977, A Doll for the Child Prostitute, and 1992, Padmavati the Harlot and Other Stories. Now, some collections of poems which were published were in 1964, The Sirens was published. 1965, Summer in Calcutta was published. Summer in Calcutta is that collection of poems from which most of the poems of Kamala Das are taken, which are some of those poems are prescribed in a course. And then 1967, The Descendants was published. 1973, The Old Playhouse and Other Poems. 1977, The Stranger Time. 1979, Tonight, This Savage Right, that was in collaboration with Pritish Nandi. 1984, Collected Poems. 1985, the Annamalai Poems. 1997, Only the Soul Knows How to Sing. 1999, My Mother at 66. And 2001, Ya Allah. So this was actually the biographical and the literary journey of the poet. Now, when you read the poems like The Looking Glass, The Freaks, and the other poems, you'll find out how I is dominant, how subjective elements are dominant. She started to write poetry at that time when personal experiences took the place of colonial and nationalist themes in English poetry, written by Indian women. You have studied the poetry of Toru Dutt and Sarojini Naidu. In the poetry of Toru Dutt and Sarojini Naidu, colonial themes, nationalist themes, myths, legends were very dominant. This personal, experiences were not a part of that. We have here in the poetry of Kamala Das. Now, when Kamala Das started writing, the offensive individualism which she introduced in her poetry was very shocking to the readers. She is considered as a subjective poet, and her poems are products of uncontrolled emotions. Actually, the poems are the emotional outpourings. Eliot's dictum is not applicable here. Her poems are not an escape from personality, as Eliot has said. Eliot, if you remember in one of his essays, Tradition and the Individual Talent, says, honest criticism and sensitive appreciation should be directed not upon the poet, but upon the poetry. Then he says, the man who suffers is different from the mind which creates. And he calls Wordsworth's formula inexact, and he says, poetry is not a turning loose of emotion. It is an escape from emotion. It is not an expression of personality, but an escape from personality. So the case of Kamala Das, this is not applicable. Eliot's dictum is not applicable because her poems are the emotional outpourings of her personal experiences. I read one of the important statements by Kamala Das. She said, if I had been a loved person, I would not have become a writer. Look at she's talking about the personal elements, personal experiences, how the personal experiences are put into the literary creation. If I had been a loved person, I would not have become a writer. I would have been a happy human being. I suppose I started writing because I had certain weaknesses in my system. I thought I was weak and vulnerable. That's why we attempt poetry. Poets are like snails without the shells, terribly vulnerable, so easy to crush. Of course, it has given me a lot of pain. Each poem is really born out of pain, which I would like to share. So, in the poems, you find her personal experiences. The poems are the products of uncontrolled emotions. So, the subjective elements are very much dominant in her poetry. Next comes confessionalism, confessional elements. You have studied Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence, and you call D.H. Lawrence as a confessional novelist. Now, Kamala Das, as I told you, was a revolutionary poet who started a trend of frankness and openness in the treatment of the subjects in her poetry. And that is why we call her a confessional poet. Confession, what sense? Now, this confessional mode of writing, it has its origin in mid-50s in America. John Berryman, Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath are the chief exponents of confessional poetry. Confessional poetry is actually a hybrid, mode of poetry that comes to existence as a consequence of the popularity of the psychological, studies. Uh, when we say confessional poetry, it means objective, analytical, or even clinical observations of incidents from one's own life. She can, in the case of Kamala Das, she can most definitely be considered a confessional poet because her poems often focus on her personal life, including many aspects of her life that other people would prefer to keep private. You will find out the best examples in the poem like Interaction, Freaks, The Looking Glass, The Sunshine Cat. So, confessional elements are very much strong in her poetry. Next comes nostalgia and homesickness. I told in the beginning that she did not have healthy marital relationships. There was a lot of frustration and disappointment in her life. So to get a relief from the frustration, she turns to her past memories where she got ideal love as a child. She showed her nostalgic element in her poems like My Grandmother's House and Hot Noon in Malabar. Both these poems are published in her collection of poems entitled Summer in Calcutta, and both these poems are prescribed in your course. Now, in both these poems, I'll tell you later that how past and present are contrasted. The present time is in no way worth living, as she says, and the past is inspiring and the memory is worth retaining. She wants to retain the memory of the past because that was very glorious. Her memory with grandmother, with a place in Malabar and so on. When she thinks of her past and her present life, she thinks that how fast the time goes. Today my grandmother is no more. I cannot see her again. The poem which I have just referred, My Grandmother's House, it presents a nostalgic picture of those days, which Kamala Das spends at her grandmother's house. She remembers her past days, which she spends at her ancestral place in Malabar. You have it in Hot Noon in Malabar. Now, she wishes that her childhood time could come back, and then she becomes emotional when she thinks about her ancestral house and her parents. So all these points are there in Hot Noon Malabar that I'll discuss in quite detail when I teach you the poem. So this nostalgia and homesickness is again a very important theme in a poetry. Now, then comes death, decadence, and disease. Now, this theme is also very dominant in her poetry. Her poetry contains an acute concern for decay, death, and decadence. Now, we have some references in her autobiography, My Story. My Story tells us that she was, sometimes even ready to, welcome the death. She was going to embrace the death. She was so nervous. But physical decay and destruction definitely haunt her inescapably. She tells in a story that at the age of 19, she suffered a nervous breakdown as a neglected wife. And she was commanded to live all alone in a closed room with sunshine peeping through a window. The same kind of reference you have in the poem, which is prescribed in the quote, is a sunshine cat. Next comes feminine sensibility. This is also a very important theme in her poetry, feminine sensibility. Now, Kamala Das tries to depict the picture of an oppressed and marginalized woman in her poetry. She wrote about the woman who suffers in the society. Almost all her works depict her concern for the social and cultural construction of gender, raising her voice against marginalization and exploitation of women. She is essentially a poet of the modern Indian woman's ambivalence. Now, courage and honesty are the features that mark her poetry. Most of the women which are depicted in her poetry challenge the established norms of the society and assert themselves. So, very often the poetry of Kamala Das is analyzed from the feminist perspective. You can study Kamala Das as a feminist writer, and you try to find out how feminism is visible in her poetry. Now, next comes search for identity. Search for identity, quest for identity is again a very important theme. A woman has no place. She has no place in the male-dominated society, in the patriarchal society. She's looking for a room of one's own, using Virginia Woolf's line, a room of one's own. She's looking for identity. So most of the poems, you'll find out how the persona is looking for the identity. Identity crisis is there, search for identity is there. Next comes the failure of marriage and sexual frustration. As you know that her relationships with the husband were not healthy. So this failure of marriage and this frustration becomes the subject matter of most of her poems. Next comes betrayal in love. When she did not receive love from the side of the husband, she went to the other men. But the men, as usual, were very, they deceived her. They cheated her. They did not respond properly to her. They used her and they did not give the love which she required. And that is there in the poem The Sunshine Cat. How betrayal in love is there. Next comes love, lust, and free and frank treatment of sex. Now, the image which she creates in her poetry is of a nymphomaniac. And this picture, free and frank treatment of sex, which is found there in her poetry, made her poems sometimes, as critics say, obscene and vulgar. But we must always analyze the poetry from the perspective of a scholar. We must see the literary beauty in the poems. So this love, lust, and free treatment of sex is there in her poetry. So when we analyze her poems, we find the subjective elements, confessional elements, feminine sensibility, nostalgic elements, search for identity, the failure of marriage and sexual frustration, betrayal in love, love, lust, and free treatment of sex. All these points are there in her poetry. So when we discuss the poems which are prescribed in a course, like My Grandmother's House, Odd Noon in Malabar, and The Sunshine Cat, then I think you'll be able to analyze the poet also in a better manner. But these video lectures will help you to understand the poems better. So in my